Hello, this is Paul Lucas, and welcome to another episode or segment of Jumpstart Nature Photography. This is the Craft of Photography, Part 3. We're going to talk about aperture and depth of field. This is part of the exposure triangle discussion. And as I mentioned at the beginning of all my presentations, you can see my work at paullucasphotography.com. And if you'd like to have me come and speak at your organization or hire me for a workshop or a class or get a copy of this presentation, send me an email at paul@pauljumpstartnaturephotography.com. Also, I'd like to encourage you to contact me about getting a no-charge, positive, and constructive critique of your work. Same critique as I do in my classrooms with my students. If you're interested, there's details here. Please send me an email at paul@jumpstartnaturephotography.com. So we're still in the craft of photography, part 3 here. These are the other areas of photography we're going to look at as we go forward, eventually composition and creative use of light. These are to get you the foundation, some foundation skills, some core skills. This is not the end-all, be-all answer to all the technical issues or concerns or compositional things that you will encounter or do in photography. But my hope is that through this course, it will give you enough information to get out in the field and start making great photographs that I know everybody is capable of doing. So we're still in the craft, part 3, looking at the exposure triangle, and the last part of that we're going to discuss is apertures and depth of field. So as I mentioned, remember, photography, there's really two overarching components kind of to it. As I mentioned, the craft, and this is what we're working on, learning how our lenses, our cameras, the exposure we use, our equipment affect the art and vision or the aesthetic of photography. And that's the second component, right? Creating great compositions and how we process them afterwards. So in the exposure triangle, we've already discussed in previous segments, shutter speed and ISO. For a bit of an overview around exposure and some topics around that, we'll cover that a little more in creative use of light, but please go back to the very first part 1 of the craft presentation, which is the shutter speed. There's a bit of an introduction. Some more time is spent discussing exposure in general. Today we're going to look at aperture, and aperture is related to your lens. So the aperture is how much light travels through the lens. So think of it as a faucet. You open the faucet wider, more water travels through it. If you open the faucet less, then less water travels through it. So it's the same idea. How much light travels through the lens that hits the sensor. Shutter speed, remember, controls how long it's open. So you could have your water faucet open in a very narrow, letting a small amount of water open for 1 second or for 10 seconds. Or you could have it very wide open for 1 second, right? So again, aperture controls how much light travels through the lens. And we'll see the effect of how that changes when we change the opening of the lens. And shutter speed controls how long. So we express always, in photography, we talk about stops and f-stops. For shutter speed and ISO, the stops. We talked about that in the first presentation. So go back and take a quick look at that for review if you don't remember the discussion about stops. But in talking specifically about apertures, settings, we talk about the f-stop setting in photography for the aperture of a lens. And an f-stop is really the ratio of the diameter opening, so how wide your lens is open, to the lens focal length. So if you had a 50 millimeter lens and and the widest opening is f2.0, that would be 25 millimeter opening. So it's a ratio of that. It's a fraction. And the aperture controls what we call the depth of field or the depth of focus. That the depth of field determines how deep the focus is in the picture. If I have a group of 10 people standing in a line to get on a bus and I focus on the second person, the depth of field will determine whether I just isolate that person in the picture or if I have more people in focus. So keep that kind of little idea in mind, the number of people in focus in a line. So we'll talk again, as I mentioned in the very first presentation, I like to think in whole stops. Our cameras are capable of doing 1/3 and 1/4 stops, including shutter speed, ISO speed, and your aperture openings. But it's easier for me to mentally think about when I make changes in the exposure triangle and how it affects other parts of the exposure triangle. I'd like to think in whole stops. So traditionally in photography, hole stops are 20, 28, 56, 8, 11, 16, 22, 32. There's settings on both ends. Some cameras have variable apertures, meaning if it's a zoom lens, you might see it say f3.5 to f4.5. So at the widest focal length of that lens, the widest opening that's available is f3.5. If it zooms, maybe it zooms 3 times or 4 times to a telephoto range from a wide angle range, then the widest aperture opening is f4.5. And then you would still have the stops beyond that, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22. And you would have the potential, like I said, I like to think in hole stops. It's just easier for me when I'm doing reciprocals, which we'll talk about in the next presentation. The effect of changing one corner of the triangle and how that affects the other ones. So I like to think in hole stops to do that. But these are really fractions. So it's really, when you see a 2.0 on a lens, that means it's really 1/2 the size of the focal length. So again, if I had a 100 millimeter lens or a 100 millimeter lens and my widest aperture opening was 2, then it's really the widest aperture opening is 50 millimeters, meaning so it's 1/2 f2.0. So these are fractions of how wide of opening the lens has when taking a photograph. And I'll just mention, so again, in zoom lenses or some fixed lenses, you'll see you'll see larger aperture numbers. They vary. The more expensive the lens, typically the wider aperture opening. There's more glass needed to create a wider aperture opening. It's more expensive to manufacture. There's other things that goes into the manufacturing to make all the physics work out really well to get good sharp images. So less expensive lenses, you'll find variable aperture openings on zoom lenses. You won't find as wide of aperture openings available. On more expensive lenses, you'll see like an f4, which I just noticed I left out here. It's 20, 28, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22, and 32. You'll see an f4, which is constant across the zoom, or f2.8. Those are going to be more expensive lenses. They have better glass. All right, so here we can see this is a 50 millimeter, or what we call a standard lens, and we can see some settings. The widest aperture opening on this is f1.8, and I skipped 2.0. I could have gone to 2, because typically 2 is the first number, or half. If we open from 2.8 to 2, we're opening one stop. So these are hole stops are starting at 2.8, 4, 5, 6, 11, 16, and 22. And so you can see as the aperture number gets larger, the opening is smaller, because remember that's 1/22nd, 1/22 at the far right as the opening. So it's 1/22nd of the diameter is in ratio to the focal length of the lens, which is 50 millimeters. So it's 1/22. So that's what it actually looks like on your lens when you're opening or closing the aperture. So depth of field. So the aperture opening affects the depth of field, or depth of focus. Some people like to use DOF for depth of focus. I learned depth of field. The way to think about it, so as you go up in the fractions, up to like 1622, f16 or f22, you get a greater depth of field or focus on all kinds of lenses. And we'll talk about, though, how that is affected by a couple other factors. But generally speaking, you want a greater depth of field or focus, you go to a higher aperture number. If you want a lower depth of field or focus, you go to a lower aperture number. So a way to think of this is thinking about even though you're not taking necessarily a picture of people standing in a line, but when you're looking at your photograph and you decide how deep I want my focus to be, think of the number of people standing in a line. If I only want a couple people to be in focus, use a lower aperture number, right? f2.8, f4, 5, 6, whatever that might be. If you want a greater depth of focus, use f11, 16, or 22. Now, cameras, lenses, because of the physics, are designed to provide the sharper image typically around f8 or f11. So that means the way the light is hitting the sensor will provide the greatest focus of all the color lengths, wavelengths, and things like that to give the sharpest image. So there's a bit of a trade-off between sharpness of the light data coming in and the depth of focus. As you go up beyond f8 or 11, you start to get what's called diffraction. Some of the diffraction that softens the image can be corrected in Lightroom. So you'll see often photographers like myself, f16 is kind of my favorite. It's a good trade-off between a good depth of field and a minimal amount of diffraction or diffusing of that sharpest light path onto the sensor. So often f16, I shoot at f16 and I do sharpening within Lightroom to correct for any diffraction or to help promote a sharper image from the diffraction caused by shooting at such a small aperture opening. On occasions, I do shoot f22. I might do that with a macro lens to get macro lens have a very small depth of field. We'll talk about what a macro lens is in a later presentation. Or I might use a very high aperture number, or f16. Remember, it's a small opening though, to get a sunburst, the little rays coming out of the sun, when shooting directly into the sun. If I want to do something that has selective focus, where I want to emphasize a key compositional element, I want that in focus and everything else to be in soft focus, then I use a lower f-stop. So you'll see that. I would encourage you, when you're out shooting, you find your composition. If it's a scene that traditionally you would think of, I need a lot of depth of focus or depth of field, then I would start at f16. But I would go from f16 down to my lowest aperture setting on my camera for that focal length to see the effect as you go down, as you change your aperture opening. All right, so a little example. This is a telephoto zoom lens. I'm fairly close to these guys, so the depth of field is very, very narrow for the most part. I focused on the Stormtrooper, which is the third in line if you're a Star Wars fan. So you can see this is a telephoto lens, short range, not extreme, not 200, 120, f4. I focused on that guy, and you can see Yoda is completely out of focus, and the droid and the other, sorry, I don't know my Star Wars characters well enough, people are out of focus. As you see, I went to f8. Then you can see the depth of focus or field is expanding, and I went to f22 on this lens. So for most purposes, everybody is in focus all the way through. So part of the depth of field, again, it's affected by the focal length. The higher the focal length, the less depth of field you have. The distance to your subject will alter the depth of field as well. So I'm just thinking about this for a second. Sorry. So the main thing are the lens type and how close you are, and then of course the f-stop determines that. One thing I'll point out, or a couple things I'll mention real quickly. So if you were taking that third photograph and you want the ultimate depth of field from front to back, you can use focus stacking software. So there's software that I would maybe first focus on Yoda, and then the droid, and then the Stormtrooper, and then next couple people, and I would shoot all of them at f8 or something. So can you actually take slices of the sharpest part of the picture, stack them together in the software, and make a ultimate depth of field? So here is kind of a creative question or thought. Our eyes we see everything perfectly in focus from close to us to far away. But as things get farther away, we lose details. We see, if we're standing on a block and 2 blocks away is a big, beautiful elm tree, we can see the elm tree. We know it has leaves. We can even make out probably the shapes of the leaves, but we can't see all the detail of the leaves. We may not be able to, delineate all the edges of the leaves or the veins in the leaves. So our eyes have a natural drop off as to what it's in focus, but the detail we can see. So lenses kind of work that same way. I'm not against focus stacking software. I've used it. I've experimented a little bit. I don't use it in my day-to-day work. This year, in 2016, I plan to look at it a little bit more. But if you look at the f22 shot, for all intents and purposes, everybody's in focus. If this were 30, 50, 50 feet of people separated or something instead of 36 inches, and we were standing closest to Yoda, he of course would have the most detail and be in focus. But the guy farthest away, of course, we can we can make out his beard, we can see his hands and everything, but we can't see the detail. He's in focus, but we can't see all the detail. So just some thoughts about depth of field and focus stacking on the aesthetic or the art part of your photography. So as I mentioned, lens focal length affects depth of field. Wide angles typically have deeper depth of focus, and a telephoto has a shallower depth of focus. Also, how close you are when you focus on your subject or how far away you are will also affect the depth of field. So again, here's our little chart where there's less light hitting the end. On the left side, less light is hitting the sensor. On the right side, more light is hitting the sensor, right? So, and the f-stops, the larger the number, f22, less light is going through the lens. f2.8 or f4, more light is going through it, right? So again, changing that, these are whole stops. So when we change things by a whole stop, then we'll see the effect of having or doubling the light. And that will affect, and we'll talk about this in the reciprocal presentation coming up next, what that means, how this affects the exposure triangle. So if we had an exposure, a good exposure calls for f8, but we have a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second, what do? We want to give it more light. So how can we get one stop more of light? We want to get our shutter speed to be 1/60th of a second. So we could open the aperture by one stop, f5 to f from f8 to f5.6. We're letting more light in through the lens to hit the sensor, and that would change our shutter speed. The equivalent exposure would be 1/60th of a second. So we're going from f8 at 1/30th of a second to f5.6 at 1/60th of a second. That gives us the same exposure. Conversely, say we're out in the field and we start out at f8 and ISO 100. Of course, we always assume the lowest ISO in starting out. And we see we're in f8, we're taking a photograph of a tree maybe or something, and we're at 1/25th of a second. And we know we want to get a little more depth of field around that tree, and we certainly have enough shutter speed. So we could have our shutter speed, we could shoot at 1/60th of a second and get a very sharp exposure. There's not much wind or very little wind. So what would we do? What can we do to get to, what would we do in this situation? So we could increase our aperture number. We're actually making it a smaller opening to f11. That's one full stop. We're having the amount of light reach the sensor is decreased by one stop. So that to get the equivalent, we increase the time the shutter is open to 1/60th of a second. So just some thoughts. Again, I know this is really hard to follow and comprehend. You might feel like you're in advanced algebra or even calculus, but these are good things to understand and work towards some memorization here of your f-stops, at least in whole stops, shutter speeds, and ISO, and the effect of the three on getting a correct exposure. Because the three together, remember, an ISO setting, your aperture opening, your f-stop for your lens, and your shutter speed create what we call a good exposure, will be used to create a good exposure. And again, go back to the first part one presentation in the craft, and I talk a little bit about metering and a little bit more about exposure. And we'll also review it a little more when we get to the creative use of light. So this is the end for this presentation. If you have any questions, please drop me an email. The email address is paul@jumpstartnaturephotography, and I'll see you in the next segment. Thanks.